A Lewis machine gun barrel glows red-hot in the Western Australian sun. Thousands of emus tear through a barbed wire fence with mechanical efficiency. Major G.P.W. Meredith stares through iron sights at a sea of shifting feathers. 10,000 rounds of ammunition wait in crates, ready to turn the tide. The birds do not retreat. They scatter into a chaotic, high-speed blur. The military had arrived to save the wheat, but they had underestimated the enemy. By the time the smoke cleared, the Australian Army had been outmaneuvered by flightless birds. The date was November 2, 1932. Major Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery stood in the Campion district with 2 soldiers. They carried 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of military-grade ammunition. Their target was a population of 20,000 emus migrating inland. The birds had become an existential threat to the struggling wheat farmers of the region. These farmers were mostly World War I veterans, granted land by the government to forge a new life. They had petitioned the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, for direct military aid. The birds were not merely eating the wheat. They were breaking through rabbit-proof fencing, leaving vast gaps for vermin to destroy the remainder of the crops. The settlers faced total economic ruin during the height of the Great Depression. Major Meredith and his men scouted the landscape for their first engagement. They spotted a flock of approximately 50 birds near a dense patch of scrub. The soldiers prepared to ambush the animals, believing the firepower would force a quick surrender. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to see the tactical nightmare the military faced in the Australian bush. The emus did not act like a static, conventional army. As soon as the Lewis gun opened fire, the flock broke into small, agile groups. The birds sprinted in multiple directions, their speed making them nearly impossible to track with a heavy tripod-mounted weapon. Major Meredith watched as his bullets kicked up dust behind the fleeing targets. The first engagement ended with almost no losses for the emu population. The military had entered the outback expecting a simple culling operation. Instead, they discovered that an emu at full sprint was a target that defied standard infantry tactics. The Great Depression gripped Western Australia with a suffocating financial iron fist. Wheat prices collapsed across the global market. Families in the Campion and Walgoolan districts watched their livelihoods turn into worthless dust. Many of these farmers were veterans of the First World War. The government had granted them this land as a reward for their service. They arrived with high hopes and empty pockets. By 1932, the reality of their situation had become dire. The wheat crops remained their only hope for survival. Then the migration began. 20,000 emus moved inland from the coast. The birds viewed the wheat fields as a vast, open buffet. They did not stop at the perimeter of the farms. The emus trampled the fragile stalks under heavy 3-toed feet. More importantly, the birds smashed through the rabbit-proof fencing. These fences were the only barrier against a secondary, smaller plague. Once the emus created gaps, the rabbits poured into the fields. The rabbits finished what the emus had started. The settlers saw their entire year of labor vanish in a matter of hours. They were not just losing crops, they were losing their homes. A delegation of farmers traveled to Perth to beg for assistance. They eventually petitioned the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce. The farmers argued that the situation had escalated beyond civilian control. They requested the only force they believed could stop the Avian invasion. They wanted the Australian military. Sir George Pearce saw a chance to demonstrate government support for the veterans. He authorized the deployment of the 7th Heavy Battery. He dispatched Major G.P.W. Meredith to the heart of the crisis. The Minister of Defense expected a swift, decisive victory. He did not foresee the logistical nightmare that awaited his soldiers. The farmers waited with rifles in hand, watching the horizon. They expected the military to bring order to their chaotic landscape. They did not realize that the birds had no intention of retreating. The stage was set for a conflict that would defy all military logic. The date was November 4, 1932. Major G.P.W. Meredith moved his men toward a local dam in the Campion district. Sergeant S. McMurray carried the heavy Lewis machine gun across the parched earth. Gunner J. O'Halloran followed with the ammunition crates. The soldiers spotted a massive concentration of birds near the water. Over 1,000 emus gathered in the heat to drink. The soldiers set their tripod in the scrub. They aimed the barrels directly into the center of the flock. The birds remained unaware of the impending strike. Major Meredith gave the signal to fire. The Lewis gun erupted in a rapid mechanical rhythm. Dust kicked up around the legs of the startled emus. Bullets struck the earth, missing the moving targets. The birds did not panic in a predictable fashion. They split into hundreds of individual high-speed projectiles. The soldiers struggled to track the chaotic movement of the flock. The Lewis gun suddenly seized. The weapon jammed after only a dozen birds fell. The remaining hundreds of emus sprinted away into the horizon. The soldiers stood over the silent, overheating machine. The opportunity for a decisive strike vanished in seconds. The birds left the dam empty and quiet. The military detachment stood alone in the Western Australian sun. The reality was that their technology could not match the biology of the enemy. The birds possessed a natural armor of thick feathers and dense muscle. A bullet that would drop a man often failed to stop an emu. The soldiers spent the afternoon clearing the jam. They watched the dust settle on the empty plain. The mission at the dam resulted in a tactical disaster. The farmers watched from the distance, their expressions hardening. They had expected the power of the Royal Australian Artillery. Instead, they witnessed the failure of modern infantry equipment. Major Meredith recorded the encounter in his military log. He understood then that the birds were not a conventional foe. The failure at the dam signaled the beginning of a long, humiliating retreat. The desert floor lay littered with thousands of spent brass casings. Major G.P.W. Meredith stood over the jammed Lewis machine gun. The desert sun beat down on the rusted metal of the weapon. 6 days had passed since the 7th Heavy Battery arrived in Campion. The military log recorded the expenditure of 2,500 rounds of ammunition. The official tally for those 6 days stood at 50 confirmed kills. The ratio of bullets fired to birds destroyed defied standard military logic. For every 50 bullets sent downrange, only a single emu fell. The birds continued to roam the wheat fields in massive destructive flocks. Their mobility rendered the heavy artillery equipment largely obsolete. Word of the operation reached the cities of Eastern Australia. The media began to frame the military struggle as a comedy of errors. Newspapers like the West Australian published reports of the soldiers' mounting frustration. The public outcry grew louder with every new report of a failed ambush. Members of the House of Representatives took notice of the mounting costs. The government faced intense pressure to justify the use of military assets. Every round of ammunition consumed state resources during the Great Depression. The mission lacked the tactical precision required to handle the avian threat. Major G.P.W. Meredith found his unit at the center of a national scandal. The political backlash reached a breaking point by November 8, 1932. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, ordered a temporary suspension. The soldiers dismantled their tripods and cleared their heavy crates. The military detachment began their retreat from the dusty Campion district. The wheat farmers watched the trucks pull away from their ruined fields. The emus remained in the interior, undisturbed by the departing infantry. The first phase of the operation concluded in total failure. The government had bet its credibility on a quick, decisive call. The reality was that 2,500 bullets had failed to secure the harvest. The soldiers left the outback with their reputation significantly damaged. The birds moved freely through the gaps in the broken rabbit-proof fences. The economic crisis for the veterans in the district deepened overnight. The suspension provided the military a brief respite from public scrutiny. But the underlying problem of the emu migration remained entirely unresolved. The suspension of the military operation left the wheat fields of Western Australia undefended. The emu migration continued unabated through the broken fences of the Campion district. The farmers watched their crops disappear into the stomachs of the birds. Their economic survival during the Great Depression relied entirely on the harvest. They sent desperate appeals to the government in Perth. The Premier of Western Australia, James Mitchell, heard their pleas. He viewed the military withdrawal as a betrayal of the struggling veteran settlers. He contacted the federal government in Canberra to demand a resumption of hostilities. The political pressure on the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, intensified daily. Sir George Pearce faced an impossible choice between military pride and regional stability. He ignored the tactical failure of the first week of combat. He authorized Major G.P.W. Meredith to return to the field. The order reached the 7th Heavy Battery on November 12, 1932. Major G.P.W. Meredith loaded the Lewis machine guns back into the transport trucks. Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran prepared the remaining crates of ammunition. The soldiers returned to the dusty landscape of the Walgulan district. They moved with the same equipment that had failed them only days before. The military logic remained unchanged despite the obvious lessons of the dam incident. They prepared to engage a target that had already proven itself superior in agility. The farmers welcomed the soldiers back with grim expectations. They knew the birds had not moved since the military trucks departed. The political maneuver between Perth and Canberra ignored the reality on the ground. The government prioritized the optics of action over the effectiveness of the mission. Major G.P.W. Meredith positioned his men near the wheat fields once again. The desert heat shimmered over the barrels of the Lewis machine guns. The birds gathered in the distance, indifferent to the return of the infantry. The second phase of the operation began under a cloud of bureaucratic desperation. The state had committed its resources to a war against a flightless bird. The failure of the first week had not altered the fundamental strategy. The soldiers checked their weapons and waited for the command to fire. They stood in the path of a migration that no amount of lead could stop. Major G.P.W. Meredith maneuvered his trucks across the arid landscape throughout late November. The 7th Heavy Battery pursued the emu flocks across the dusty plains of Walgulan. The birds maintained their distance with a speed that baffled the soldiers. The Lewis machine guns remained hot in the unrelenting Australian sun. Ammunition crates emptied rapidly as the soldiers chased the elusive targets. The vast outback swallowed the percussion of the gunfire. Major G.P.W. Meredith documented every engagement in his official military ledger. The exhaustion of resources became the defining reality of the mission. By December 10, 1932, the military detachment reached their breaking point. The soldiers loaded the last of their equipment back onto the transport trucks. Major G.P.W. Meredith ordered the final withdrawal from the Campion district. The operation concluded without achieving the objective of protecting the wheat harvest. The final logbook entries revealed the staggering scale of the expenditure. A total of 9,860 rounds of ammunition had been fired into the scrub. Official military records confirmed exactly 986 kills during the entire deployment. Major G.P.W. Meredith claimed an additional 2,500 birds died later from sustained wounds. The discrepancy between the expenditure and the results painted a grim picture. The military force left the outback with the emu population largely undisturbed. The wheat farmers watched the last of the military convoy disappear from view. Their fields remained vulnerable to the migrating birds. The government's attempt to solve an agricultural crisis with military hardware ended in silence. The dust settled over the empty brass casings left behind in the dirt. The experiment in mechanized pest control had reached its inevitable, unsuccessful conclusion. The House of Representatives in Canberra gathered on December 10, 1932. The legislative chamber echoed with the fallout of the failed military operation. A.E. Green, the Australian Labor Party member for Gwydir, stood before his colleagues. He held the official records of the 7th Heavy Battery in his hands. The documents outlined the total ammunition expenditure of the previous month. A.E. Green questioned the wisdom of deploying machine guns against flightless birds. He pointed to the discrepancy between the bullets fired and the birds destroyed. The floor of the House remained quiet as he read the final totals. The government had authorized nearly 10,000 rounds of military ordnance. The result was a permanent destruction of the wheat harvest in the Campion district. The emus remained in the fields, indifferent to the parliamentary debate. A.E. Green challenged the ministers on the efficacy of the entire mission. He argued that the state had wasted resources on an impossible tactical goal. The reality was that the emu migration continued across the broken rabbit-proof fences. The settlers in Western Australia faced a bleak winter without their grain. The legislative debate highlighted the absurdity of the military's recent failure. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, faced direct scrutiny from the opposition. The members of the House realized the military campaign had achieved nothing. The wheat crops were gone, and the birds had moved deeper into the territory. The government's attempt to solve an agricultural crisis with artillery had collapsed. A.E. Green noted that the emus remained a persistent threat to the region. The debate ended with the grim realization that no further military aid would follow. The federal government retreated from its position of active military intervention. The settlers were left to manage the pest problem without the 7th Heavy Battery. The parliamentary inquest confirmed the failure of the mechanized pest control experiment. The records of the debate were filed away in the National Archives. the story of the military deployment became a permanent part of Australian history. The House of Representatives turned its attention to the ongoing economic crisis. The emus continued their seasonal migration through the Western Australian outback. The failure of the mission marked the end of the state's brief war against nature. The media reports faded from the front pages of Australian newspapers. Journalists had enjoyed the spectacle of a military defeat at the hands of birds. The comedy of the situation eventually gave way to the silence of the outback. Farmers in the Campion district returned to the reality of their damaged wheat fields. The government abandoned the idea of mechanized warfare against nature. In 1934, the state introduced a bounty system for the destruction of emus. This decentralized approach shifted the burden of pest control back to individual settlers. The federal government refused subsequent requests for military intervention in 1943 and 1948. Bureaucrats in Canberra chose to avoid the embarrassment of another failed deployment. The rabbit-proof fences remained broken and ineffective against the migrating flocks. The economic distress of the Great Depression deepened for those living on the frontier. The emus continued to thrive, largely indifferent to the shifting policies of the state. Their survival demonstrated the limitations of military hardware against an adaptive, natural force. The brass casings in the dirt became the only physical reminder of the campaign. History books later codified the event as a peculiar, singular failure of the state. The reality was that the emus had won the war of attrition. You look at the world today and see systems built to control the uncontrollable. You trust in the precision of modern tools to solve your most persistent problems. But like the settlers of 1932, you are standing in a field that is already shifting beneath your feet. The chaos you think you have managed is simply waiting for the right moment to return.